Texas farmers built a genius trap that outsmarted 2 million wild boars. Imagine walking out to your farm at sunrise and finding your entire field gone. Not stolen, not burned, flipped upside down, like a bulldozer went through it at midnight and vanished before you woke up. That is not a scene from a disaster movie. That is a normal Tuesday morning for thousands of farmers across Texas, and the culprit isn't a machine at all. It's an animal. A smart, fast-breeding, almost unstoppable animal that has been quietly winning a war against American agriculture for over a century. Tonight, you're going to find out how a handful of ordinary farmers finally turned the tables on an enemy that outnumbers them by millions, and the trick they used is so simple, so patient, and so clever that once you hear it, you'll wonder why it took 100 years to figure out. Stick around, because the ending of the story is the part nobody expects. Texas has a wild pig problem, and problem barely covers it. Wildlife agencies estimate the state is home to somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 million feral hogs, and that number keeps climbing year after year, no matter how many are removed. These aren't the pink, docile pigs you picture on a farm. They're lean, muscular, bristle-coated animals with tusks, thick hide, and an attitude that makes them closer to a wild predator than livestock. They travel in family groups called sounders, sometimes a dozen animals, sometimes 3 or 4 dozen, moving through fields and forests like a rolling storm front. Wherever they go, they leave behind torn-up earth, snapped irrigation lines, and crops that look like they were plowed by a lunatic in the dark. The financial damage is enormous. Various agricultural surveys have put the yearly cost of feral hog destruction in Texas somewhere in the neighborhood of tens of millions of dollars, and when you widen the lens to the whole country, the number balloons into the billions. That figure includes ruined crops, wrecked fences, collapsed pond levees, contaminated water sources, and a steady stream of vehicle collisions on rural highways. Farmers don't just lose a harvest. They lose equipment, they lose topsoil to erosion, and in bad years, they lose the will to keep planting in certain fields at all. To understand how this got so far out of hand, you have to go back a few centuries. The ancestors of today's feral hogs first arrived in North America with early European explorers and settlers, who brought domestic pigs along as a portable food source. Pigs are famously good at escaping enclosures, and over generations, enough of them slipped into the wild that small feral populations took hold across the South. For a long time, that was manageable. A rural nuisance, not a crisis. The real trouble started later, when landowners in parts of the South began importing Eurasian wild boar specifically for hunting. These weren't soft farm animals. They were rugged, aggressive, built for survival in forests and mountains half a world away. Predictably, some of them got loose too. Once the imported boar met the existing feral pig population in the wild, the two groups interbred. What came out of that mixing was something new, an animal combining the boar's toughness and instincts with the domestic pig's incredible reproductive rate. The result is the modern feral hog, and it may be one of the most successful invasive animals on the continent. The reason these animals are so hard to control comes down to basic math, and once you see the numbers, the scale of the problem makes a lot more sense. A female hog can begin reproducing well before her first birthday. Her pregnancy lasts around 4 months, and a typical litter runs somewhere between 4 and 6 piglets, though in years with abundant food, litters of 8, 10, or more aren't unusual. Here's the part that really breaks the math. A sow doesn't need much recovery time. She can become pregnant again within weeks of weaning 1 litter. There's barely a pause in production. Run that forward, and a single breeding pair can theoretically be responsible for well over a dozen offspring in a single year, and those offspring are often capable of breeding themselves before the year is out. It compounds fast. A rancher can spend an entire season trapping and shooting 100 hogs, feel like real progress was made, and then watch the population bounce right back within a couple of years if even a few breeding females were left untouched. You're not just removing animals. You're trying to outrun exponential growth. And for most of the 20th century, the growth was winning. Now, let's talk about why the damage looks the way it does. Because it isn't random destruction, it's a direct result of how these animals feed. A hog's snout is a genuinely remarkable piece of natural engineering. The tip is reinforced with tough cartilage, and behind it sits a thick slab of muscle running up through the neck and shoulders. That combination lets a full-grown boar do something most people wouldn't believe: dig into hard-packed soil, flip stones, and tear up sod with nothing but its face and a whole lot of muscle behind it. This digging behavior is called rooting, and it isn't gentle. The animal drives its snout into the ground at an angle and shoves forward with its whole body weight, peeling back soil in long strips to expose grubs, roots, worms, and anything else edible hiding underground. Then it steps forward and does it again and again. A single hog working through the night can tear up a surprising amount of ground in just a few minutes, and when an entire sounder of 20 or 30 animals works a field together, the destruction adds up fast. By morning, a healthy crop can look like it was hit by heavy machinery. Here's the detail that tends to frustrate farmers the most. Most of that damage isn't even about eating the crop. A large share of the destruction comes from trampling, rooting for insects underneath the plants, and wallowing in wet irrigation channels until the banks collapse. The hogs aren't stripping the field bare out of hunger. They're wrecking it as a side effect of foraging for something else entirely. It's the agricultural equivalent of someone tearing your house apart looking for loose change under the floorboards. Given how severe the problem became, you'd think the solution would be obvious: let people hunt them and let the population fall. Texas actually did exactly that. Feral hogs have no closed season and no bag limits in the state. You can hunt them almost any way, almost any time. On paper, that should have crushed the population. In practice, it barely made a dent, and the reasons why reveal something interesting about human nature as much as pig biology. Recreational hunters are naturally drawn toward big, impressive animals, the massive boars with dramatic tusks that make for a great photo. But those trophy males aren't the engine driving the population explosion. The engine is the sows, quietly producing litter after litter, and the young hogs that mature fast enough to start breeding within their first year. Removing a giant boar and leaving the rest of the sounder intact barely slows anything down. It's like trying to stop a flood by removing one drop of water at a time while ignoring the open floodgate. Some regions tried financial incentives instead, offering payment for proof of a killed hog. That sounds like it should work, but it created a strange and counterproductive side effect. Once a dead hog became worth cash, some people had an incentive to keep hogs around rather than eliminate them. Investigators in more than one area found people quietly feeding wild hog populations to keep numbers high, or, in extreme cases, breeding them privately just to have a steady supply to cash in. A program built to shrink the population ended up, in some places, doing the opposite. Then there's the trap problem, and this is where things get genuinely eerie because it turns out these animals are far smarter than most people assume. The classic approach was a small metal box trap, baited with corn, with a door that snaps shut when something steps on a trigger pan. It works exactly once. A curious young hog wanders in, the door slams, and every other animal in the sounder scatters into the dark, thoroughly spooked. Here's the unsettling part: they remember. Feral hogs have been the subject of cognitive studies comparing their problem-solving abilities to dogs, and in some tests, even primates. A sow that watched a family member get trapped will steer her group wide around that same spot for a long time afterward, and the younger pigs learn that caution by watching her. Within a generation or two, an entire local population can become what wildlife managers call trap-shy, animals that will eat every kernel of corn scattered right up to the open door of a trap and then simply refuse to cross the threshold. Every clumsy, half-successful trap doesn't just fail to catch enough animals, it actively teaches the survivors how to avoid the next one. This is the wall that farmers spent decades running into. Hunt the wrong animals, and the population regrows. Offer bounties, and someone finds a way to profit from keeping the problem alive. Trap carelessly, and you train the smartest, most cautious individuals to survive and pass their wariness down to their young. Every tool seemed to make the problem more resistant rather than less. The breakthrough came when a small number of farmers stopped approaching this like a hunting problem and started approaching it like a logistics and intelligence problem. Instead of asking, "How do I kill more hogs?" they started asking, "How do I remove an entire family group in one single, decisive action, so there's no survivor left behind to learn anything?" That shift in thinking changed everything that came after it. The first tool in this new approach wasn't a weapon at all, it was a camera. Specifically, a cellular trail camera, a small, weatherproof unit strapped to a fence post or tree, equipped with a motion sensor and an infrared flash invisible to animals in the dark. When something moves in front of it, it takes a photo and sends that photo straight to the farmer's phone over the cellular network, no matter where he is. This tool completely changed the information balance. For generations, farmers had been reacting to damage they discovered the next morning, with no idea when the hogs arrived, how many there were, or which route they used. A trail camera flips that. Over a week or two of quiet, unnoticed observation, a pattern starts to emerge. Which gap in the tree line the sounder favors, roughly what time they show up, how many animals are traveling together, and which so seems to be leading the group. None of this spooks the animals, because the camera leaves no scent and makes no sound. It just watches, patiently, night after night. Armed with that intelligence, the question shifts from how do I catch one hog to how do I capture the whole group at once? And that required a completely different kind of trap. Instead of a small metal box, these farmers began building large circular corrals out of heavy steel panels, sometimes 30 feet or more across, tall enough that a grown boar can't jump it, and staked firmly enough that nothing can root underneath the edges. Instead of a small trigger door, these corrals have a single wide gate, big enough for an entire sounder, 30, 40, even more animals, to walk through at once. Here's where the real cleverness starts, and it's almost the opposite of how traditional trapping works. For the first week or two, sometimes even 3, the gate on this giant corral stays wide open. Nothing gets caught. The farmer isn't trying to catch anything yet, he's trying to build trust. This stage is called pre-baiting, and it works by turning the hog's own intelligence against them. Each night, corn gets scattered in a trail leading up to the open gate, and more of it spread generously inside the corral itself. In the beginning, only a nervous young pig or 2 might creep close enough to grab a mouthful before bolting at the slightest sound. Over the following nights, more animals get comfortable. Eventually, the lead sow herself walks all the way inside, eats freely, and walks back out completely unharmed. That's the whole point. She survives the experience, so she comes back, and she brings the rest of the group with her. The corral stops looking like a threat and starts looking, in the mind of the sounder, like the safest and most reliable food source in the area. Their natural caution, the same instinct that made hunted populations so hard to trap in the first place, gets slowly worn down by repeated, risk-free meals. This patience is the hardest part of the whole method, and it's also the reason so many people fail at it. It's tempting to close the gate the moment a dozen hogs show up feeding inside. But farmers who report the highest success rates are the ones who resist that urge entirely, waiting until the wariest, most cautious animals in the group, usually the older sows, finally commit and walk all the way in without hesitation. Rush the process, and you might catch a handful of hogs while the smartest ones learn to avoid your corral for good. Wait it out, and entire sounders walk involuntarily, night after night, with zero fear. The final piece of the system is what makes it all come together, a remote-triggered gate. The same cellular camera that gathered intelligence for weeks now streams live footage straight to the farmer's phone. Instead of hiding in the brush holding a tripwire, waiting to spring a trap on whatever happens to wander closest, the farmer can sit at home, watch the corral fill up in real time, and count heads. He waits for stragglers. He waits for the last piglet to trot in behind its mother. Only once the entire group is inside, with nothing left outside the gate, does he tap a button on his phone. A signal travels out over the cellular network, a mechanism releases, and the gate drops shut behind the whole sounder at once. From the hog's perspective, there was nothing to be afraid of, because there was nothing there. No human scent on the wind, no gunshot, no clumsy tripwire for a wary animal to notice and avoid. The threat came from a screen miles away. And because the entire family group gets captured together, there's no traumatized survivor left to associate that corral with danger and teach the next generation to avoid it. The lesson simply doesn't get passed down because nobody escapes to pass it down. Even a well-run trap like this only solves part of the problem, though, because hogs don't respect property lines. Clear every animal off one farm, and a fresh sounder can wander in from a neighboring property within weeks. The most effective operations recognized this early and started coordinating across multiple farms. Simple group text chains where one landowner who spots a sounder crossing his property at dusk warns the farms downwind, so traps can be pre-baited in the right places at the right time. Instead of each farm fighting an isolated battle, neighboring landowners began operating almost like a single defensive network, closing off the gaps that used to let populations rebuild from next door. Put together, the whole strategy really does look less like pest control and more like a military campaign broken into distinct phases. First comes intelligence gathering, weeks of silent camera observation to understand exactly how local population moves and behaves. Then comes the main event, corral traps placed on the busiest travel routes, patiently pre-baited until entire family groups are willing to walk in and stay. And finally, cleanup, using thermal optics and trained dogs to track down scattered individuals and stragglers who avoided the main trap. It's worth being honest about the results too, because this isn't a story about total victory. Well-executed remote-triggered corral traps can capture a very high percentage of a targeted sounder in a single event, which is a massive improvement over traditional trapping. But the underlying biology hasn't changed. Because of how fast these animals reproduce, landowners generally have to remove a large share of the local population every single year just to keep numbers from climbing again. Skip a season and the population can rebound surprisingly quickly. Nobody managing this problem is claiming the war is over. What has changed is the balance of power. Fields that used to lose tens of thousands of dollars worth of crops in a single night are now losing a fraction of that, because farmers finally have a method that doesn't just remove a few animals, it removes entire family lineages at once, before they have a chance to teach the next generation how to avoid the next trap. It took roughly 400 years for two separate mistakes, an escaped colonial food supply and an imported hunting trophy, to combine into one of the most damaging invasive species in American history. It's taken patient, coordinated, tech-assisted trapping to finally start turning that story around.